Well, ladies and gentlemen, we are going to start up again. So I'll just wait for colleagues who are conversing to come back and join us. Come on in and join us if you're joining us. There they come. Very good. Wait for them one at a time. All right. We're going to go ahead and get started for this third session. We're going to go ahead and get started for this third session this afternoon. Thank you for your ongoing attention. A couple of announcements and just clarifications. If you are coming to supper tonight, that's wonderful. There will be students and people available to help lead you there, because if you don't know where you're going, no press dining room, you need some direction. So Paul Fields will be one of the people leading people through. My student Joshua Shoemaker will be another. So they'll stand up at the end and you'll just follow them to get there, okay, if you have a dinner ticket. If you don't have a dinner ticket, this does not apply. If you didn't get a dinner ticket, but oh, these are such nice people, I want to have dinner with them, you can still come to the dining room. You have to pay at the door, and I think it's $14. So just bear in mind, okay? So make your plans. If you want a ride to have the supper, so you don't know where it is, or you don't feel like walking that far, if you want a ride, just wait outside by the street here, and we will come and pick you up and drive you there and drop you off, okay? So you don't have to worry about where it is or how to get there. All right, and we are back here at 7 o'clock for the evening lecture. So I would like you to take anything valuable with you. Okay, do not leave a laptop, do not leave an iPad, anything like that. We do not secure this room, okay? Take your valuables with you, but we are back here at 7 o'clock. If we have time, and we hope we will, we'll open up the meter center upstairs for you to look at our exhibit before the 7 o'clock session. But for that, you can't come this way. You'd have to go through the main entrance of the library on the second floor and go up 2 floors. And our students will lead you to that if you're wondering about that, okay? If you're totally bewildered, come here and we'll make sure you get upstairs. That'll be about 6:45 or so, and so you have time to tour it before the evening session at 7, okay? All right. After all these announcements, my great pleasure to announce our third speaker for you, Adrian Weimer. She is professor and she's a historian of colonial America and early modern religion and politics. She received her PhD in 2008 from Harvard University, and she's currently professor of history at Providence College in Rhode Island. Her publications include Martyr's Mirror, Persecution and Holiness in Early New England, published by Oxford University Press in 2011. She's in the final, very final stages of completing her next book, which will be published by the University of Pennsylvania Press. Her presentation for us today is titled, A Public Spirit for Zion's Sake, Puritan Activism in the Early Restoration. Please join me in welcoming Adrian Weimer.
Thank you so much, Karina, and to all of you. It's my first time here, and the welcome has been so extraordinarily warm. I'm already making plans to come back for Tulip Day, which I hear is in May, booking my plane tickets. So it's really delightful to be here. Thank you to everyone who pulled this together and made it possible, and to all of you for being here. So let's talk about some American Puritans. The Boston minister John Norton probably regretted his choice to take in a boarder, a young Harvard student in 1660. Crown was studying at Harvard, but he really wanted to be a playwright back in London. And he learns in 1660 of the restoration of the monarchy, and he thinks, oh, this is my opportunity. Now, as you know, the king who returned was Charles II. He's the son of the king who was killed after the English Civil Wars back in 1649. And Puritans played a role in the regicide. So John Crown starts eavesdropping on Norton and his family and guests to their home, and he starts taking notes. And he starts eavesdropping on visitors as they discuss what you guys probably discussed over the break, right? Religion and politics. He's taking notes on all these conversations. And John Crown is thinking, maybe I can win the king's favor by informing on these odd and dangerous Puritan colonists. John Crown is there at Norton's house when two regicides show up, Edward Whalley and William Goff. These are two men who actually signed the death warrant for Charles I. They escaped to New England in the summer of 1660. And so John Crown gathers up his notes and he takes them back to London, and he manages to get an audience with royal officials. And this is what he tells them. He says, oh, those colonial Puritans, they embraced Whalley and Goff. He says, Whalley and Goff, he says the colonial Puritans wished more such good men as they would come over, meaning welcoming arch traders into Puritan New England. And then he's probably embellishing the truth quite a bit. Crown goes on to claim that Whalley said frequently and openly that if what he had done against the king were to be done, he would do it again. Basically, a second regicide is brewing in New England. John Crown wants to brand these Puritan colonists as extremists, as anti-monarchical radicals. And scholars too, in many ways, have wanted to see political extremism and many kinds of extremism in early New England. What the sources reveal instead, I would argue, is first of all a spectrum. And second of all, I think most importantly, an ethic of public-spiritedness, one which holds on to a tension between honoring rulers and a willingness to sharply critique those of any camp who betray the common good. And this tension is hard to hold on to then and now. It's a tough tension. Puritans, maybe with the exception of John Preston, don't have it all systematized. They're figuring it out as they go, like we all are, right? And I will say, focusing on public-spiritedness is not at all to overlook colonial brutality towards enslaved Africans or Native Americans, which is the subject of much very important and excellent recent scholarship. Rather, it's to identify one available tradition of political theology and public engagement, one which groups of multiple backgrounds over the decades and even over the centuries will appropriate, will evaluate, will draw on according to their own priorities. It's a malleable tradition. It's one nurtured within Puritan communities and then available to many other groups within American history. Now we see this activist public-spiritedness most often in manuscript fast day sermons, in town petitions, in election sermons, and of course in letters and court records. Puritans wrote a lot. You could not read in a lifetime the manuscript record from these people, even for one decade. And I tried, and there's just too much. These guys wrote and wrote and wrote. People today, I'm going to say present company excluded, rarely study these sources because we think we already know everything about election sermons, right? Perry Miller said it, we studied them, it's done. And the fast day sermons and the petitions are handwritten and they're tucked away in archives and they're a little bit challenging to read. So as I've had the privilege of being immersed in these sources, I've seen four things predominantly. One, that ordinary people had an obligation to be aware of political events. Two, they were supposed to keep a laser sharp eye on absolutism in either church or state. Three, they were supposed to pray over their contributions to the public welfare, perhaps even risky ones. And four, they were supposed to engage in the difficult work of building consensus. All of this is a part of a Puritan culture of public-spiritedness. Okay, so back to Norton, 1661, he's giving the election sermon for the colony-wide May election. And he mentions people like John Crown, the informer. He says, we have severe observers. Tongues are not untaught to inform against us. I'm aware of these people in London, and it's true. Many detractors after the return of the king are trying to label colonial Puritans as extremists, dangerous rebels. And Norton says this in reply: God knows, and angels and men shall know, that we are orthodox. God's outcasts are not fanatics. And then he goes on to give what I think is one of the most vivid images in Puritan literature, drawing on the book of Revelation, of course. He says, the woman in the wilderness may have the vomit of the dragon cast in her face. If you let it lie on, you will suffer. Wash it off, therefore, by an apology. Thus did Justin Martyr, Tertullian, and others in their time. Apology, of course, means defense here. So Norton wants his fellow Puritans to go to the new king to honor him, to challenge the lies that are being reported by people like John Crown, and to set the record straight. Interestingly, the biblical story that Norton goes to at this point is that of Esther. It turns out actually to be the most popular biblical story of the early Restoration in the Puritan colonies. They go over and over again back to Esther. So like Esther, Norton says, go in unto the king and speak to him. She did so with the peril of her life. And it's right in the biblical story, Esther, as we know, does risk her life to advocate with the Persian king for the Jews. She was loyal. She was also an activist who intervened for her people. Now, on the tension between honoring rulers and critiquing them, Norton edges a little bit towards the honoring side. Later on, he's going to argue passionately before the Massachusetts court, which is the legislative body, that they need to compromise on certain non-essentials like oaths. He basically is going to say, if they comply not with the king's demands, the blood that should be spilt would lie at their doors and upon their heads. It's a strong argument for limited compromise. He's actually childless, but he's has helped raise a 12-year-old nephew, his namesake, John Norton Jr., and he's preparing him for Harvard College during these years. And you can just tell in his writings, he's thinking about his nephew. He can't bear the thought of his nephew and his nephew's generation dying futilely before English warships, which will show up in a few years. There's another pastor, Thomas Shepherd. Now, this is the son. This is not the famous one, though he should be more famous. He's a brilliant second-generation intellectual. But Thomas Shepherd leans more towards defiance. He leans more towards critiquing and defying the king. And these two pastors, by the way, are good friends. Shepherd preaches an extraordinary series of fast day sermons in the 1660s on this topic of public-spiritedness. And this is where I'm getting the quote for today's talk. Okay, so it's a cold December morning in 1662 in Charlestown, Massachusetts. And Shepherd decides to hold up the prophet Isaiah's words, "For Zion's sake, I will not hold my peace." He goes on to offer a powerful definition of a true citizen of Zion. And by Zion, he means the civic community. True citizens, he says, should be restless in prayer as the waves of a stormy sea. They should pray with holy impudence, like the poor widow in Luke's parable, or like Deborah in Judges 5. You can tell he's aware there's women in his audience, right? Prayer does not, however, substitute for suitable endeavors and actions. In Shepherd's model, this is a quote, "The spirit of a true citizen of Zion, a sincere Christian, 'twill be in motion like the waters of a living spring on behalf of churches and cities. Those with a public spirit for Zion's sake will experience a restlessness of the whole man. In our thoughts, our minds will be plotting and contriving the welfare of the community. In our memories, in our wills, expressed by the incessant motions of our affections, in our speeches and words, in our actions and behaviors and endeavors and constant labors." You can almost get the rhythm of the sermon, right? From these notes. And we do have both, we have notes and then we also have handwritten notes of people in the audience. Shepherd is urging prayerful mobilizing for action on this fast day in 1662, a public-spirited restlessness. Now, some of you may know there's a lot of historians on Twitter called Twitter Storians. You guys found this yet? It's kind of fun. There was a Twitter blow up last week because this journalist, very famous journalist, said that nobody cares about historiography. And like 200 Twitter Storians get on and defend why we think historiography is great, right? Why it's important to know what historians have said over time and the debates, the kind of inner ballgame among of the field. So I'm going to attempt here to give about 3 minutes of historiography and make it interesting. You can tell me later how I did. There has been very good historical work in English and transatlantic Puritanism over the last 2 decades that has laid the groundwork for understanding this ethic of public-spirited restlessness. Back in the 60s and 70s, historians wanted to see Puritans as radicals, as revolutionaries, maybe sort of 60s radicals like themselves, possibly. And this is when the term Puritan Revolution was popularized to describe the English Civil Wars, even though, as we know, many other people besides Puritans are involved. The problem with this strand of historical thinking is that so many Puritans were trying to work faithfully within institutions. Right? A lot of them would not have liked or recognized that description, that characterization of themselves. So the next generation of scholars, led by a guy named Patrick Collinson, have gone back to what I think is a much deeper set of sources and recovered strong links between Puritans and the slow, patient institutional reform of both church and state. Collinson avoided old, what we call Whiggish errors of tracing any kind of direct lines between Puritanism and modern notions of liberty and democracy. You know, their terms are not our terms. Their world is not our world. But in Collinson's view, Puritans were intent on reforming institutions. And while highlighting Puritan moderation, Collinson acknowledged that Puritans are usually the first people into town meetings to raise their hand. You know these people in your town, right? Those people who are right up front, wanting to get a word in. They were among the most likely to preach prophetic sermons, openly critical of injustice. And they were among the most likely to hold monarchs and other rulers accountable to the common good. Okay, that's the end of the historiography section. Try to keep it short. In the 1660s, with the restoration of the monarchy, some anti-Puritans get control of Parliament, and they want revenge for the English Civil War on the Regicide. New legislation demotes English Puritans, along with Quakers and Baptists, to second-class citizenship in England and criminalizes their worship if they gather more than 5 people. It's much more difficult at that point for Puritans in England to outspokenly criticize the government or the bishops. Many are imprisoned, some flee to the continent, and some flee to New England. Charles II is also gradually pulling England towards an absolutist state. He's emulating the French king, Louis XIV. He's taking away local self-government in English towns and boroughs, and he's consolidating power to the monarchy. So by the 1660s, ideals about strong accountability, constitutional accountability for rulers are collapsing in England and endangered on the European continent as well. As you can imagine, these nonconformists, these Puritans who suffer repression in England, struggle with feeling useless. Right? One of these guys is a poet named John Melton. And Melton, of course, Oliver Cromwell's secretary, outspoken defender of the regime, had escaped execution, somewhat surprisingly, right? But remained, like most English Puritans, in what he calls straitened and difficult circumstances, in addition to his blindness. In a private letter, John Melton prays that God would not leave him useless, whatever remains for me in this life. You can just sense that poignancy. I didn't want to be useless. Many English Puritans continue to struggle with a sense of political irrelevance, though they do a ton of writing in this time period, so they kind of channel it into more literary forms. Nothing could have been further from that sense of uselessness among their counterparts in New England in these years. Men and women mobilize, they jump into political action. They are determined to maintain their Puritan outposts within what's really an essentially inhospitable, increasingly inhospitable Restoration empire. So Puritan colonists are well aware that not everyone has the freedom to act on these public-spirited ideals. They see themselves as one of the last remaining outposts of Puritan reform, what they call the good old nonconformists, which is so amazing that this came out, Peggy, in your speech, that it has an afterlife, right? What they mean by good old nonconformists, or the spirit of the good old nonconformists, you see it over and over again. What they mean is a tradition of reformers going back to the late 1500s, a tradition of reformers who honor the king, but work to gradually bring institutions into more biblical alignment. That's what they mean by the spirit of the good old nonconformists. These people insist on limits to a ruler's power. Those limits are going to be based in religious, civil, and natural law. So Norton, he'd urged the colonists, like Esther, to go to Charles II and plead their case. Little did he know that the colonists are actually going to ask him, along with Simon Bradstreet, husband to the poet Anne Bradstreet, to go as their agents to England to meet with the king, playing an Esther-like role. So Norton and Bradstreet are now personally challenged to live out this model of public-spiritedness, even as they have to think about their own safety. Right? People are getting executed in England. They have to think about their families' own good, their church's own good. They have to make a decision about whether they're willing to go. So there's hundreds of manuscript documents for this episode in colonial New England history, the decision to send agents to Charles II in 62. It's a very difficult decision. Why? Agents might be expected to renegotiate the charter. The charter is the legal foundation of the colony. It's signed, it has a royal seal, right? It's from the king. And if you have to renegotiate it, that can basically undermine your right of self-government, which protects your right to run your own churches. So this is high stakes for agents who might go. And if the agents go to London and refuse to negotiate, they could easily be imprisoned or even tortured. Torture is illegal in New England. It's not illegal in England at this point. So not all colonists think sending agents is a good idea. Maybe we can just lay low and maybe Charles II will forget about us. That's always a nice strategy. So you can imagine the magistrates and the deputies, these are elected leaders, they gather together in the Boston townhouse and they argue for hours late into the night. They're trying to figure out if it's a good idea to send agents at all. And they call in local ministers to help them think through ethical and biblical principles. These are Calvinists, right? So the ministers have no authority over civil matters. They keep the line between the two kingdoms, but they are often brought in as ethical advisors. So it's a rousing debate in the courthouse. I really wish I'd been there. It would have been very fun to hear the two sides back and forth. What we can tell is that both sides were heard, that a large number of people actually spoke. They did not find an easy solution. It looks like there was kind of a stalemate. But then they have another strategy. They take smaller groups of magistrates, deputies who are the representatives of the town, and elders who are the ministers, out to forge new position statements. It's like if we took this whole group and said, okay, divide up into groups of 6, and we've got to figure out this problem, and so come back with a solution. You know, it's kind of a classic strategy of making people do tough committee work. So there's an extraordinary series of kind of backroom outdoor negotiations, and they finally arrive at a consensus over whether to send the agents. They'll send them. They're going to send 2 men to London, but only if the 2 men are Norton and Bradstreet. It's the only 2 people they're willing to send. The only ones they trust in this moment to go and not to betray their charter or their liberties. But neither wants to go. It's easy to preach about Esther. It's hard to be Esther. They have real concerns, right? They have concerns about compensation. They have concerns about clarity of the mission. They have concerns about shouldering the responsibility for the outcome if it's not what people want, right? Norton needs his church permission. It's congregational church. He has to have the permission of the church to go. He also wants his wife's input. One of the things actually Bradstreet asked for specifically is time to travel home to Ipswich to discuss the matter with Anne. And we don't know what they said. That would have been another fun conversation to listen in on. But we know that he returns with much greater clarity regarding his terms and writes them out very, very clearly. So Bradstreet and Norton both want financial, legal protections. They want a say in the wording of the colony's letter to Charles II. And the next couple of months are fascinating. So many colonists join in to this effort to help the negotiations. Some get involved in fundraising, some find a ship, some organize provisions for the ship. There's a group of people who gather documents, right, manuscripts they might need for evidence as they're trying to make their case to the king. There's other people who develop what's basically what they call a method of secret conveyance, which is how to bypass royal spies. So they have lots of ways of doing this. They write in code, they put letters in the flaps of books and, sew them back up. They have, so they figure out a way where they can actually get information back and forth without being intercepted. And all these people are working to meet Norton and Bradstreet's concerns and to follow through on the court's very hard-won consensus about sending agents. At one point, the obstacles seem overwhelming, actually, and it's pretty cool. We have a prayer from somebody who was involved. And they say, why are we using all lawful means? Why, when we are using all lawful means, should so many clouds be darkening our paths? You sometimes feel that. I sometimes feel that way. Even so, they say, we're committed to our own peace and safety, to the honor of the Lord's name, church, and ways. And this decision, they say, was made upon mature counsels in sundry debates. Right? And then they say dangers accompany inaction as well. The Lord's servants would be grieved, friends in England offended, the king's majesty incensed, our adversaries animated, our God dishonored. Doing nothing also has consequences. Things seem to be going off the rails. The governor isn't really supporting the mission. Very helpfully, there's a small earthquake that week, which kind of jolts people into beginning stuff up. And then finally, with Norton and Bradstreet's input, the court does agree to revise the letter in a more precise, submissive direction. They load the provisions shipboard, but then Norton gets sick. He falls ill. They have to delay. And the shipmaster who's owns the ship, he's getting really mad. He's like, every day you're delaying, I'm losing a lot of money here. So he actually finds some of the magistrate at the Boston lecture sermon and he kind of gets in their face. And he says, I can't keep delaying forever. You've got to make a decision about what you're going to do here. Remember, it's only Bradstreet and Norton who were the ones authorized to go. It looks like after all this work, the plan is going to fall apart. The magistrates make plans to release the ship, write explanatory letters to London. They unload the provisions, even though they actually put them by this tree with a secret hope for divine intervention. Let's keep them close by just in case. Another tense day passes, and then the following dawn, according to his own writings, the Lord so strengthens Norton that he decides to board the ship. Right? He's ready to go. So they get the provisions, they reassemble the letters, they reorganize the money, and Norton and Bradstreet sail forth on their Esther-like mission to meet the king. And Bradstreet writes a poem for the occasion. She says about Simon's departure, at thy command, O Lord, he went, nor naught could keep him back. Then let thy promise joy his heart. O help and be not slack. Then she goes on to ask God specifically to give their letter favor in Charles II's eyes. Remember, this is the letter that Norton actually influenced. So she writes, remember, Lord, thy folk whom thou to wilderness hast brought. Let not thine own inheritance be sold away for naught. We'll see later in the Fast Day records, many colonists join the poet in praying for their agents, and they hear horrible rumors. The rumor mill is really deadly in these years. They hear that the two men are detained, that they're in prison, that Norton is in the Tower of London. You can imagine being Anne, right, hearing about these rumors. It turns out to be untrue, but it's very frightening. In London, Norton and Bradstreet have both friends and enemies. Richard Baxter, the great Presbyterian pastor, helps them. He offers introduction and advice. There's a non-Puritan colonist in London, Samuel Maverick, who actively tries to undermine them. He actually tells Lord Chancellor Clarendon, basically the Secretary of State, that Norton and Bradstreet themselves had long spoken and acted violently against His Majesty's interest. I don't know where it's coming from, but he's very interested in undermining their mission. We're seeing here maybe some of that vomit that Norton was worried about. And Maverick basically says if the king favors these agents, it will mean a shattered New England. Much better, he says, to require the full oath of allegiance, which, by the way, means swearing total non-resistance, even to a tyrant. And in time, Maverick says, to impose the Church of England by force. Right? That's the way you're going to bring New England to heel. So they're a great surprise when Norton and Bradstreet finally meet with Lord Chancellor Clarendon in the spring of 62. It goes pretty well. Clarendon has an eye for New England's strategic potential, especially those old growth forests in Maine that make those really nice 3 feet diameter ship masts for the Royal Navy. Privately, he will call colonial Puritans, quote, a very humorous people, meaning full of like different humors, right? They must be handled with great dexterity. Norton and Bradstreet pretty straightforwardly request reconfirmation of their charter, of their liberties of self-government, and Clarendon, according to the record, responds with fair promises. The problem is that nobody's willing to put a signature to those promises. Baxter tries to warn them. Right? He tries to warn Norton and Bradstreet that things are not entirely what they seem. Baxter worries that they're being set up for disappointment, as he himself in many ways was. And over the course of their stay in London, it becomes clear that the new parliament and the new crop of bishops intend to crush Puritanism. Baxter recalls later that Norton and Bradstreet, quote, at last saw how things went, and those in New England heard at last how we were all silenced and cast out. So Norton and Bradstreet are actually there. They witness Black Bartholomew's Day on August 24th, 1662, when under Parliament's Act of Uniformity, 900 nonconformist clergy are ejected from the Church of England. It turns out that Clarendon and the King have plans to redesign the church and the civil institutions in the Puritan-led colonies. They had no intention of making a signature to those promises. They make a series of demands. They give them to Norton and Bradstreet to take back to Boston. These are the demands. Colonists should revise their law codes, legal documents, take the full oath of allegiance. They should extend sacraments to everyone of good and honest lives and conversations, so no bar to the Lord's table. Further, in elections, they should overlook candidates' religious opinions and outward professions and include in the franchise freeholders of competent estates. So basically putting voting rights back only to the wealthy rather than having them based on piety. These changes are basically going to open the door for wealthy, high Anglican royalists to acquire political control. By the way, this is the same moment, 1662, when the king and his brother, the Duke of York, are designing the Royal Africa Company and making a huge investment in the British slave trade in order to fill the royal coffers. Okay, so Norton and Bradstreet return, they hand deliver the king's demands, and many colonists, as you can imagine, express alarm. Norton argues for limited compliance. He's thinking about his nephew. The magistrates and deputies respectfully hear him, and then they begin another heated debate. One source calls it a great struggling. Most of the colony's leaders fear the king's demands are a prelude to a royalist takeover of both church and state in the Puritan-led colonies. Obeying the king in full might forestall violence, but it could also spell disaster for the colonists' ideal of godly reform. The debate was heated, but each person speaks in turn. And from what I can tell, they actually listen to the other side's ideas. It's such a contrast with these later debates in the 19th and 20th century, right, where you feel like they're talking past each other. I really think there's a theologically informed political culture at work here. Many say things like, it's essential to respect the goodwill and piety of those with whom we disagree. One columnist warns against uncharitable censures. No one should say another group is, quote, disaffected to the cause of God and his people because they see not in some things as others do, end quote. They remind each other frequently that those on the opposing side are also lovers of the welfare of this plantation. For these people, the ideal is not so much majority rule as to diligently keep up rational, biblical, historical, and natural law arguments and painstakingly build consensus. Now, in this moment, a compromise of some kind seems essential. The court finally agrees that changing their legal documents to be in the king's name is fine. They cannot, however, approve the king's demands to change their franchise baptism or oaths. And at this point, they do something of, to me, great interest. They open up the conversation to the general public and they ask for input. So I think they realize that if they're going to maintain their self-government and defy the king, they're going to need a really broad political consensus for that to work. So over the next 4 years, there's an extraordinary number of people who become informed about the political crisis, who send in their thoughts, who offer time and money and prayers and connections on the colony's behalf. And now I've got some show and tell for you. So this is an example of a town petition that is sent in during these years. This one happens to be from Hadley, Massachusetts. And it happens to be actually that the two regicides are hiding out in Hadley. The pastor there builds on a little addition to his house for them. So Hadley has a particular stake in these debates. The start of the petition basically says, if there's appearances of danger toward us, we think now more. Right? If there's ever been a time when we feel endangered, it's now. Disastrous state shakings among us. God hath in a day of danger in the world bid us enter into our chambers, and he hath kept us safe with himself. So basically what they're saying is our first response to the political crisis is to pray, right? We are safe when we are in prayer. And then I've got, this is the part that has, I think is getting appropriately more attention. The Hadley petitioners say, we would fear God and honor the king. It's hard to do both sometimes, right? Keep those together. Whatever royal grants of grace we have received, either from the Lord in heaven or kings on earth, the accepting, holding fast, and maintaining of the same with due thankfulness is the true magnifying of that grace. So they're not going to easily give it up. They say to throw away or to cowardly suffer ourselves to be flattered or frightened from it is the despising and dishonoring thereof. We have a right from God and man to choose our own governors, make and live under our own laws. Our liberties and privileges herein as men we prize and would hold as our lives. So there's many petitions like this. And it's, we don't know exactly how the petitions worked. Some of the ministers are involved. Sometimes they sign, sometimes they don't. Sometimes it's just town people involved. We have some precedent from the English Civil Wars and how petitions were formed in England. But we really think, from the best we can tell, that this is grassroots mobilizing, right? This is people getting together and trying to think hard about their own commitment to the political crisis, their own understanding of where rights and liberties come from. There's many more of these, but here's just another one so you can see it. This is the one from Dorchester where Richard Mather was involved. I'm happy to talk more about any of these petitions. Another place where people organize is at fast days. So, this is when they get a day off work, which is kind of great. They don't get to eat though until it's basically supper time. So that's difficult. But, if you read these sermons from the fast days and the notes that people took in church on the fast days, you can see that built into the structure of a fast day was time and encouragement for personal reflection. So at fast days, people repent, of course. They identify their sins. These people are very self-critical, but they also make resolutions for their own contribution, their own commitment to activism. And in the fast day sermons and sermon notes from these years, we get a sense of colonists' fears and hopes. They're hearing about the ejection of ministers on Black Bartholomew's Day in London. They're actually starting to read some of the farewell sermons that those ministers preached, a really interesting genre. And they start to engage in colony-wide fast days to pray about things like the afflictive and low estate of the cause and people of God universally, right? So they're not parochial, they're aware of what's going on in Europe. They don't think of themselves as in any way unique. They're part of a broader Reformed network. They're praying about what they call the prevailing power of Antichrist over the Reformed churches beyond the seas. By Antichrist, it's just a language for critiquing corruption in the church. And they're praying about public rebukes of God among ourselves. So again, they're looking inward and trying to repent for anything they can repent for in their own lives and churches and communities, especially oppression of the poor. We know in Cambridge, another brilliant second generation minister, Jonathan Mitchell, tries to call the congregation back on one of these fast days to the work of God in their society. Building God's kingdom, he says, is a cause for which God will overturn until it be erected in God's glory. Mitchell says, colonists, don't fear your detractors. God can overturn the power structures of the world. In this hour of temptation, he says, the task of New Englanders is to stand firm. And there's a lot of theology in this sermon, which is really fascinating. And one of the interesting things about it is it's quite similar to the language of the Scottish Covenanters, right? There's a lot of kind of mutual cross-fertilization that's going on here. We know about some of the people, the lay people who are participating in these fast days. So for example, Daniel Buchan, who is an advocate for Native American land rights. He's in Mitchell's congregation. And he basically says, Mitchell was helping me in these years in new ways, how local laws and government are gifts from Christ. And Mitchell's encouraging me to question how letting the king, what he says, destroy ourselves in our greatest concerns could ever be a wise course. There's some pastors who are preaching towards compromise too. William Hubbard up in Ipswich preaches a very dark warning against political activism that crosses the line into unlawful behavior. The colonist's role, Hubbard says, is not to scheme or lobby, but prepare to suffer persecution. He says even the godly reformer Thomas Cranmer had recanted before his martyrdom. Colonists would need extraordinary faith and patience to endure to the end. And I'm always happy to talk about colonial martyrdom references. They're everywhere. Very important to understanding this culture. Hubbard acknowledges the temptations to forceful resistance, and he works to prevent any foray into Machiavellian scheming. Right? So he's also saying there's a line that shouldn't be crossed. And again, each of these sermons offers time for colonists to prayerfully consider their own response to the crisis. Sometimes the ministers say, I'm not going to tell you the right path or the right answer. You should discern it. The wonderful scholar Matthew Brown has argued the genre of a fast day sermon had lay participation built into it. And I think that's right. And I think fast days are much more important to consensus building than we've yet acknowledged. So the rest of the story of Puritans and the early Restoration will have to wait till another time. But these misfit Puritan colonies in this era succeed in defying the king, even after he sends worships with royal commissioners, the same ones who are going to turn New Netherland into New York, right? And there's all kind of fascinating episodes that take place as they figure out how to do that, as they figure out how and why it's okay to defy the king. This public spiritedness is, of course, not new, yet it's particularly nurtured within Puritan communities in both England and America. These ideas are also present in the English Puritan John Owen's preaching, and he was certainly a major influence in the colonies, though his plans to migrate are thwarted. Puritans also participate in an older and broader Christian humanist tradition, one which prioritizes sacrifice of private interest for the common good. And some terrific scholars, Phil Withington and Paul Halliday, have argued that English Puritans increasingly defined godly citizenship as people who, in a self-reflective, informed way, contribute to the good of the state, doing so in contrast to subjects who seem loyal, but in fact float with the tides and betray the public trust. I think Puritan theology of vocation is also important for understanding this culture. Puritan and Reformed notions of a Christian's dual calling to a particular vocation and to the Christian life more broadly can certainly justify kinds of self-reflective political agency. So these people, I would argue, are activists, but not extremists. The ideal was to reform from within rather than tearing down either church or state. As Norton preached, God's outcasts are not fanatics. But as Shepherd said, a public spirit for Zion's sake involves a certain restlessness with the status quo, like the waves of the sea coming back again and again with creative, principled, biblical, Esther-like service. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Adrian. That's just fascinating. I think there's so many different directions we could go in. Could you maybe start by just talking about how this particular piece fits with your wider project that you're working on?
Sure. So the book is called A Constitutional Culture, How New England Puritans Defined Arbitrary Rule in the Restoration Empire. So it's talking about how people mobilized, right? How did they get involved? What kind of political theology was at work. So I talk about the petitions and the fast days, but also the committee work, which seems like a boring topic, but I think so much of American history takes place in this patient work of getting things done. So it's a book that's kind of at the intersection of American history and English history. And there's some really fascinating New Netherlands episodes, right? Because this is when the Royal Commissioners come in, and Dutch Reformed actually play a really interesting role in that story as well. And there's some interesting backroom stuff that's happening between the New England Puritans and the Dutch Reformed in this era. So there's a lot of different pieces to the story, but basically the story is about how they defy the demands of Charles II, and they're not going to let him come in and tell them how to run their colonies or their churches.
Thank you. Questions for Adrian? So Matt, you've got one at the back. You start.
Yeah, thanks a lot, Adrian. That was super fascinating. So I'm wondering, like you talked about this, you alluded to this a little bit, like the temptation to vilify the Puritans and the way they were getting criticized for everything under the sun at the time of the Restoration, right? All these petitions coming to the king and everything. So it strikes me that when we think about the Puritans in relation to, like you mentioned, whether during the Native Americans or Africans or Quakers or whatnot, it makes us want to just go that way, like the Puritans are bad. But you kind of characterize them more in a sympathetic way, like these are good citizens, they're resisting, they're not actually as extreme and so forth. I don't know if you could comment on sort of the ways in which prominent historians do both of those things right now. And you can read different books, and one book would give you the impression that Puritans are just these terrible people. And the next gives you the impression that they're actually pretty decent people. And sort of how, as a historian, we can sort of think about that and navigate those waters.
I was just having a wonderful conversation earlier about original sin, how important that doctrine is to thinking about probably both history and contemporary issues. But I think they're human beings, right? They're like us. They make all kind of mistakes. Of course they do. Right? There is that's a more personal answer, but so the history of anti-Puritanism as a historiographical genre goes back to the early Restoration. So there's a whole series of royalist-backed historians who are rewriting the history of England in the 1660s, 70s, 80s in a way that vilifies the Puritans. And believe it or not, that is still with us, right? We still have that strand of anti-Puritan historiography. The Unitarian case is really interesting because they're not anti-Puritan. I mean, they want to reclaim at a certain point the tradition, and yet by the 20s, you get, these people who are inventing words like puritanical and pretending all these people are prudes and hyper-moralists, which they're, it's just, they're just making this stuff up, right? So, I mean, some of it they're making up, right? They're half-truths, maybe. So yeah, I mean, I think, Alex Walsham is a terrific English historian. She's got an article on anti-Puritanism, and it's how it kind of goes over time. I think it's quite good. I think, they're Puritans, they become a way of thinking about what we as Americans value, and Abramson and others have done great work on this, right? So they take a lot of heat one way or the other.
Abram, do you have a question?
Sure, yeah, a lot to say about that, but I'll hold up on that. I'm very interested in the moments where they're having these pretty sharp disagreements with each other about these pretty important issues of state. And they're saying things like your quotes where you cannot say of the other side that they're disaffected. You cannot say of the other side that they do not love us. And I'm super interested in the what enables a widespread sharp disagreement. And the role of the assumption that of love that underlies it. So as long as you can assume that your opponent loves you, you could disagree with them and have a conversation. But when you begin to think that they don't love you, then you don't necessarily need to engage with the disagreement. So I'm just kind of curious about when you're looking into those pretty difficult decisions and all those disagreements, what were the limits of disagreement beyond which you could not go? And what were the and how far could you go? And what sort of enabled that? Made it possible.
So there's a bunch of petitions, and then there's a new series of petitions from North Shore colonists in 1666, which cross a certain line, and they raise that very question of what are going to be, there's free speech is never unlimited, right? So what are going to be the limits in this particular time and space of what you can say? And these petitions basically personally criticize the magistrates and accuse them of not caring about the common good. And there's some name calling involved, but most of all, actually that slides, that's okay. What they then do is they threaten to appeal to the king. They threaten to go over the colonial leaders' heads and complain directly to the king with evidence. That crosses a line. Though interestingly, they bring them in for questioning. The deputies, we have the questions, the deputies ask them. And only one of them refuses to come in for questioning of these petition writers in the 1666 is the year. And everybody else, they kind of sit down and have a chat and say, yeah, we understand why this was problematic. This one guy, whose name is Appleton, he won't even come in for questioning. And you know what, though? They don't fine him. They just let him off with a censure.
So what's interesting about that case, I don't want to take up, but what makes that cross the line is the breaking of community. Like they go outside the community, they appeal outside the community for a position. And so we're going to bring in something outside the community against you.
Yeah, that's a great point.
And it's at that point they say, no, that's not allowed. The limits of this debate are whatever you want to say, assuming you belong to this community. But if you appeal to the king, then we can't assume that you belong to this community.
Yeah, it's a nice point. Yeah. And I think what you said earlier about the assumption of love matters. Thomas Cobbett has this great sermon on prayer that's printed. And he basically says, in a church, if the pastor's convinced the congregation loves him and vice versa, that's when the Holy Spirit shows up. It's like a summarizing a 300-page sermon, but it's basically the point of the sermon. And I think it happens in court too. I think they feel that, right? That if they're going to get guidance on their political decisions, there just has to be an assumption of goodwill. And I mean, it's not that it's very messy, right? I'm not trying to flatten this out at all, but they do listen to each other.
Let's see, we'll go this side first. Go ahead.
Okay. Yeah, I'm curious because during the second generation of New England Puritanism, and with Richard Mather and Solomon Stoddard and others, the conversation of the halfway covenant, and that has bearings of participation in the community as well. Is there any connections there with all of this as far as their participation or activity, especially with these demands from the king asking for full participation of people so that rich people can be more involved? How does all of that, does the halfway covenant end up actually helping the Puritans in their spirited resistance?
It would probably take me like an hour to properly answer that question, but yes, they're absolutely, yes, absolutely. No, I mean, 1660s, right? 62 is the halfway covenant. So really brief answer would be to say, so previous historians have said there's no connection, or the halfway covenant is kind of a break, or the political is a break, and that controversy, they're unrelated. I would say they're absolutely related. Okay. And they're related both theologically and politically. So yes, I mean, expanding church membership is actually taking a little tiny step back towards the Church of England, more of a parish model. And they do make that argument at various points.
But that's part of their accommodation to the king?
Some people in some places argue that. Other people say maybe God is rebuking us through all this political crisis because we've ignored our kids, right? We haven't properly nurtured the next generation, right? So there's some providential schematics that go along with it too. But yeah, I think they're absolutely related.
Okay.
Well, it's all kind of a follow-up in both, because it's what about the word covenant?
Oh, right.
Is this kind of the reininess of how love is defined and deployed through covenant? This is an ignorant question. I don't know.
I love that question. It was so interesting to hear about the covenant. For these early folks, the covenant is not moralistic in the way that I think it becomes later. It's certainly about mutual accountability, but it's also basically about mutual confession, that we're going to be honest with each other and with God. That's what the covenants say. Again, to oversimplify, right? But yeah, they don't. I was talking with somebody about this earlier. There's paths to reconciliation, right? So you can breach the covenant, and then there's pretty clear ways that you can become reincorporated into the community.
But from Abram's question about who you know, when does it breach? It's really, the covenant is the document of record, I guess, right?
Yeah, sure.
Other questions? I think there's one in the back. Yes, go on, Phyllis.
When and where do the Christian liberal arts colleges contribute to this debate? At what stage? Later or?
Well, sure. I mean, Harvard is right. I don't know if Harvard counts, but so, Christian Liberal Arts College.
These discussions also took place at Harvard?
Yes, yes, yes. Yeah, absolutely. So Harvard college students are involved in these debates. There's Quakers also who are involved in these debates, and they come over and basically try to publicly get Puritans to admit that they're seditious. It's one of the reasons why Puritans get kicked out over and over again. It's a political issue. The Harvard college students get into debate with Quakers. So yes, the college students are involved, the professors are involved, the fellows are involved, absolutely. I mean, it really is a broad-based movement to organize, to defy the Restoration Empire.
Yes, go ahead. John.
So the issues are a little bit different in Massachusetts and the other Puritan colonies. To what extent have you looked at what's going on in Connecticut?
Yes.
Or New Haven is being forced to merge with Connecticut
Yes.
or Plymouth or?
Yeah. I mean, in a way, New Haven's merger with Connecticut is about taking a hit so that the king doesn't have more to do, right? Let's solve our own problem here, so we don't invite further royal interference. But yeah, Plymouth, I should tell some Plymouth, right? So Plymouth is absolutely involved, because when the royal commissioners, when the king's agents arrive in 1664, the first place they go is Plymouth. I mean, after they conquer New Netherland, they make it New York, then they go to Plymouth. And Plymouth could easily have caved, right? Could easily have given in to all the king's demands, which are pretty similar for Plymouth and Connecticut and New Haven as they are for Mass Bay. And the royal commissioners actually offer them a quid pro quo. They say, we'll get you a charter, which they don't have, if you agree that your governor is not going to be freely elected, but you can nominate, and then the king has a say in who the governor is. And Plymouth folks say thank you, but no. So they reject it. And because they do that, I think it makes it a lot easier for the other colonies to hold firm. So it's tiny Plymouth. It's only about 400 families at this point. Tiny Plymouth actually takes the first stand against the royal commissioners. And we have a lot of documentation for that.
Are they debating those types of issues at the United Colonies as they're doing all that?
Yes. So yes, United Colonies is involved in a couple different ways. United Colonies has a tough, it almost fractures at this point, because Plymouth decides it may not be worth it. Basically, the king thinks the United Colonies is a war confederation that's going to come out against his armies, right? So, and the United Colonies is basically helping spend all those nice fundraising dollars for John Eliot's mission. That's what their main thing is they're doing, and they coordinate war and defense and that kind of thing. But yeah, so the United Colonies are involved to a certain extent, but I will say there's a lot of tension and pressure on the United Colonies in this moment, because it may not be worth it. Plymouth doesn't think, the long story is Plymouth doesn't think it's worth it. So they pull out at this moment from the United Colonies, but they're able to patch it back together.
Abram, yeah.
I'm super interested in the scriptures being used in these debates, because first of all, I'm interested to know if you know whether they're using the King James Bible by this point or whether they're still relying on the Geneva, because the Romans 13 about submission and obedience to magistrates has in the Geneva Bible a note about saying, well, so long as the magistrate is not asking you to do something, that God would want you to do. And so there's an out given in the Geneva Bible, and part of the impetus for the King James Bible was precisely those notes the king didn't like. And so I'm sort of curious to know what when they're trying to reconcile, do we resist the king? Do we give in to the king? What scriptures are going to back up their points, and whether they're at all using the Geneva Bible to do it?
They use both. They use the Geneva Bible more. They're very aware of the notes, and I can point to specific passages, especially when the ministers are called in to give ethical advice to the court, where they're reading those notes. You can tell they quote them, right? You can tell they're reading the Geneva notes. So yeah, definitely they're drawing on that.
Oh, right. Any questions? Yeah, Peggy, go
Yeah,
ahead.
I'm sorry.
You're fine, you're fine.
But it's so hard not to, just think of today when you're, it's just such a beautiful statement of our situation today. But my question was, so they basically, to finish the story, they probably just bought some time, but were they was it those, masks in the forests of Maine that kind of made the decision to, let's just back off? And I mean, or were these arguments, did they have any purchase?
Right, right. So Norton and Bradstreet don't actually have power to negotiate. They have very strong limits on what they're allowed to do, what they're allowed to give up. Some more agents, the king demands new agents in 66 and says you have to give them power to negotiate, to renegotiate the charter. And instead, another huge debate, it's fascinating, all kind of political theory at work, all kind of theological writings at work. And basically they say, no, we're not going to send agents this time. And instead they send a whole boatload of those ship's masts. And for the time being, it works. There's also a war with the Dutch that breaks out, yeah, a lot of other things happen.
But that works out very well. All right, so first of all, let's join in thanking Adrian for her presentation.